Hi everyone, welcome. Today's check-in, as you can see from the labels here on these bins, is with the original red wiggler worms. Bins number 1 and 2 are getting up there in age. They are still positioned over here on the shelf that's off to the right where the newer of my systems are all placed. The older systems make their way over to the left. But they are in that position where as soon as there's room vacated over in the more senior shelf, they'll be moving over because they're now 236 days of age, fed 20 times over that lifespan. That last feeding 12 days ago still included bedding, because bedding is the typical thing that you do when you're feeding your worm bins. However, in my older systems, like what I've got over here already, these two systems over here as an example, were about the same age as our original red wigglers are today when we decided to give them their final feeding that included bedding, and we at that point considered them as being foraging. And then even downstream of foraging is migration, where I try to get the worms to exit their material voluntarily if possible, just by setting up a feeding zone on the edge of the system where I intend to round them up eventually. As far as our worms go, I'm still thinking, well, they're still part of the regular pack where bedding's normally included. However, today might be the day we decide to give them their last and final portion of bedding with their feeding and make it official that they are foraging. I think it is the right way to go. Why don't we decide when we get in the systems and start getting our hands dirty? Yeah, let's get our hands dirty. Let's get to work. It was only 2 check-ins ago when they were still getting leaves as bedding, but leaves include stems, and the stems are slow to break down. So the last of the leaves went in 2 check-ins ago. The last check-in we were even specifying how we're going to go with a more soft, more quick to break down completely type bedding, and that's my prepared bedding, which is mainly shredded paper and cardboard. It does have leaves in there, but just tiny fragments of leaves and very, very few leaf stems. Because I've got this little pet peeve about my finished vermicompost not really being finished until the worms have done away with all the big, huge leaf stems. Sometimes they are pretty huge. You know, the coffee filters that are serving the function in here of feeding zone indicator are holding up quite nicely. There's a lot of moisture. I can tell just by looking. I've hardly touched the material yet, but I can tell just by looking at it how damp it is. And all these springtails, they're a clue to the fact that we've got a lot of moisture here. As far as moisture goes, I was going to give them watermelon because I got just so much watermelon in the freezer. But I didn't want to introduce that much extra moisture. I wanted to give them a nice generous feeding, so I went with a bag of mixed fruits and vegetables rather than going with the watermelon, so that we can hopefully give them a feeding that's less moisture and more food. And as you saw, it included a couple days worth of coffee, so these coffee filters here can just get reused when we feed. We'll just use this stuff as supplemental bedding in the feeding zones, and then we've got ourselves a couple nice new replacement feeding zone indicators. Yeah, you know, when we came in here last time, a lot of these leaves were just resting out on the surface, left out as a top coating. 2 feedings ago, during the last check-in, we blended it all in, and it seems like it's getting worked down nicely. Oh boy. Yeah, you know, moisture has been a topic in these systems now for some time. And I think we, you know, we acknowledged that during the last check-in, and we consciously decided to return the plastic coverings to pretty much entirely cover the entire surface to allow very little of the moisture in the systems to escape through evaporation. And I guess the whole idea behind that is that if they're going to break down all those little leaf stems for us and everything else in this foraging process, trying to nip off all the old bits of remaining bedding type materials in the systems, then they're going to need moisture to get that job done. And the only thing I would want to be concerned with is seeing stuff get much more damp than what we see here. Because I guess the next thing that happens is it goes from being damp to muddy and very unmanageable, but I think we're right at that level where we can manage it still. So nothing to worry about as far as muddiness occurring. I do need to make a pretty good sized feeding zone though, if you ask me, because of the amount of stuff that we've got for them here today. So I've dug a kind of a wide trench into which we can feed. We'll do the same here in bin number 2. And we get to check out how these wormies are doing. When we got systems running like this, paired up. Speaking of paired up, this is not a pear, it's a apple, I believe. This is that system where we've been watching this apple gradually get adopted as worm food by the worms, but it's been in here for like 4 feedings now. It goes way back, a couple months old now. So whatever, here's a pumpkin stem, all kinds of funny little objects in my worm bins as usual. But yeah, let's make some nice space in here to drop in today's meal. After 12 days, it does seem like whatever we gave them last time has been for the most part consumed. Here and there I feel like I'm catching a whiff of citrus maybe. Hard to say. Clearly we found a nice big chunk of tomato right there. So there's probably still plenty of stuff that could have sustained these guys for quite a bit longer, but you know, in my worm bins, I don't wait for famine. I don't wait for the 100% depletion of past feedings. I'm all for keeping the cogs of my vermicomposting moving and keeping these little guys busy. So let's give them their task du jour. That's a pretty nice amount of bedding, and I'm almost wondering if we're gonna maybe want to be even more generous than we have been already there. Because hey, if at some point, maybe even at the end of this check-in, we decide that yeah, today should be the final application of bedding and we should now consider these systems as now foraging, then we can be rest assured that they'll have plenty of bedding to utilize as they enter into the foraging process. I wonder what's going to happen with this apple. It is just taking forever. Here's a pumpkin stem, and I believe this right here was also the pumpkin stem from the other system. So we've usually got fairly similar setups across these paired up systems, but let's press on here. This is a lot of stuff, you know. I question whether I want to give them so much, but I'm not going to worry about it. This is even another whole pear stuck in here. This is one of the contributions that I bought home from my mom's house. Somehow I got a feeling that that pear is not going to last. It's not going to be like that apple. The apple, for some reason, sometimes takes a real long time in my worm bins. Pear, on the other hand, I usually see that go super quick. Here's another one. Both systems are getting a whole pear. In addition to all this strawberry, and I see pepper tops, lettuce chunks, like the stem end of a head of romaine lettuce, tomato pieces, and obviously we sprinkled a day's worth of coffee into each system too. So that is a nice feeding. Before I forget, I'm coming in with my crushed eggshell as grit for these little guys to accompany that fairly generous feeding. And now, as far as bedding goes, I figured, you know what, this might be their last. We haven't decided yet, but I'm definitely leaning towards this being the final feeding of typical composting, and then we would, at this point going forward, consider the systems as foraging to receive no new bedding going forward. We'll still check in regularly, give them their feedings, but as far as bedding materials go, like this, what we're giving them now here, that stuff would be withheld, and they would have to make do with whatever remains in the systems and pick off all the remaining bedding type materials. So I don't know. I think we're going to do it. We're going to consider today as the final day in these systems of everyday composting. This will be the final application of bedding for these little guys. And I think this high moisture is going to help with the breakdown of all the different types of materials that are still lingering as leftovers and residual bedding. Leftovers, we've got plenty for these worms to work on, and keeping things damp is going to be to everyone's benefit. So those plastic covers are definitely going right back on as thoroughly as we had them on when we first arrived in here. Pretty much going edge to edge. And this way the entire environment will stay kind of damp. I'll naturally need to keep an eye on things to make sure things don't get muddy and out of hand and nasty, but I don't think we're at risk of having that happen. When we were still adding leaves, the leaves were always the sort of thing that seemed so nice to blend into the material after it's just been sitting out there on the surface for a feeding interval. And then as it all gets blended in, it just seems to increase the smoothness, I think, of the material, sort of preventing it from becoming muddy and clumping too much and allowing it to remain pretty fluid and flaky. There's another pumpkin stem. So this system seems to have two of them. And a very similar amount of moisture in both systems, just as damp here as it was in bin number 1. In fact, I would say that the systems are practically identical in terms of how they seem to look and feel and all that other stuff. So I guess that's a high mark we're giving ourselves on consistency. Alright, well, nothing else comes to mind. I've probably forgotten something super critical, but hopefully it's not something that they can't live without until the next check-in. But now we're going to consider these systems as being in the foraging phase. We'll check in another 10, 12, 14 days like we usually do, but that next check-in is not going to include bedding. They'll have what's been given to them up until now over time, whatever remains, and that's all they get. That's all they're going to get as far as bedding goes from this point forward. So I've made a little bit of a mess here. I've got stuff all over the place. So I've got a little bit of cleaning up to take care of and putting stuff away. But I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.